was still the province of the elite. Less than 2% of all students went on to college at all. And of that 2%, less than 1% were African American. But of that tiny segment of the population, there were men who would challenge the social order. William Henry Lewis played at Amherst as an undergrad and at Harvard as a law student, and he was voted team captain at both schools. Walter Camp named him to his all-time All-American team, and after graduating law school, Lewis became a coach at Harvard. This led to a great friendship with Harvard's #1 fan and football dad, President Teddy Roosevelt. But it also led to a backlash that foretold the hateful opposition that African Americans would face for generations. This illustration appeared in 1904 in one of America's most popular publications, Life magazine. The artist was James Montgomery Flagg, the same man who a decade later drew Uncle Sam.
I talk about this in the classroom and my students look at me like I'm crazy, and then I throw like quotes up on the board about Anglo-Saxon supremacy and anxieties around white manhood and the ordering of the races, where white men need to be on the top of the social hierarchy, and one way they can showcase their supremacy is on the gridiron.
In the first half of the 20th century, the social hierarchy was maintained by keeping black players out of the game. Southern football was completely segregated, and teams in the rest of the country almost never had more than 1 or 2 black players, if any at all. On the field, black players were often targeted by white opponents. In 1951, Drake's Johnny Bright was the nation's leading rusher and a contender to become the first black player to win the Heisman when his team traveled to Oklahoma A&M.
There's jealousy there. There's racial jealousy. There's a chip on their shoulder. There's talk in the town that the black guy's not going to last the whole game, right? Media are sending photographers there because they're anticipating something's going to go down. And it did. On the first play of the game, he was brutally attacked. There's no other way to put it. I mean, his jaw was shattered.
It was a racist attack, and it became a national scandal after the Des Moines Register published a photo sequence of the assault that would win the Pulitzer Prize. Despite his injuries, Bright was still named second-team All-American, and it was performances like his that pushed more schools around the country to integrate their teams. Michigan State, for instance, became a national powerhouse in the 1960s when Coach Duffy Daugherty recruited a host of great black players, including defensive end Bubba Smith. Segregation meant that they couldn't play in Austin or Tuscaloosa, so they ended up in East Lansing instead.
A lot of guys from the South, there was sort of the Underground Railroad to Michigan State.
A similar approach turned Oklahoma and Nebraska into 2 of the nation's most dominant teams.
At Nebraska, Coach Bob Devaney said he was going to recruit more African Americans than anybody else in history and let them play.
Rogers takes the ball at the 30. He's hit and got away. Back upfield to the 35 to the 40.
Oklahoma was our toughest opponent. They had black players that were playing.
When a black athlete came here, he knew he was going to get in the huddle. He's going to see his brothers up there in front of him playing guard, center. I'm recruiting the best players at all positions.
Get ready, let's get ready, let's get ready.
While college football in most of the country was integrating, in the South, there was resistance.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now.
desegregation tomorrow and segregation forever.
George Wallace was the governor, and it was a very combustive, explosive time in the state.
Racial tension, segregation, violence. Alabama football became that thing that white people could at least latch onto to feel good about themselves.
People in Alabama didn't view the racism and the bigotry that existed there and that permeated the culture there the same way, because they were so angry with the way they had been portrayed.
This is an unlawful assembly. You have to disperse. Your orders to disperse. Go home or go to your church.
That they couldn't see right in front of them. And they didn't view it objectively. They viewed it through a prism of, well, what about you?
Alabama coach Paul Bear Bryant was the embodiment of Southern football.
Here you go. Big captain, come out of there, through. Come on, let's go.
And white Southerners clung to his all-white teams in the 60s as symbolic sources of pride. In particular, Alabama's 3 national championship teams.
Number 1 football team in the world.
I wouldn't trade places with anyone in the world because of the privilege of being here at the university in the capacity in which I'm in. And win, lose, or draw, I think they will represent you well.
While a few Southern teams began to recruit African-American players in the mid-60s, Alabama did not. But by the end of the decade, Bryant's all-white team had become mediocre.
The push for desegregation in big-time football was just simply talent. It was not driven by this humanitarian kind of thing. It looked racism in the face and said, you may not like black folks, but if you want to compete nationally, you're going to need them.
Bryant signed his first black player, Wilbur Jackson, in December 1969.
Now you're seeing the real Alabama team.
By 1973, Jackson helped Alabama reclaim the #1 ranking in the country.
Had the South not integrated, they would have disappeared as a football region. It just wasn't tenable anymore.
The desegregation of major college football in the South was a huge boon to formerly all-white schools and to black players who were no longer denied, just because of the color of their skin, the opportunity to play on the game's biggest stages. But it didn't leave everyone better off.
The interesting thing about integration, I guess you could celebrate that, but then at what cost? At what cost? Desegregation was always done in terms that benefited the white power establishment. Broke you down, but take your best to make us strong and eliminate the competition.
For decades, historically black colleges and universities were a haven for African American players, particularly Southern black players who weren't allowed to play for schools like Alabama, Florida, or Texas. While HBCUs had limited financial resources, their teams regularly featured some of the country's best players. Integration changed all that.
In American society, integration takes place in the hands of white institutions. Major college football integration begins to look like that, in the sense of sort of, not bringing HBCU teams into your conference, but instead just sort of allowing more and more elite black players into your programs and not caring that HBCU programs might suffer or eventually die because of that.
HBCUs had always been part of what made college football great. Black colleges started playing the game in the early 1890s, and by the 1920s produced stars like Ben Stevenson, a devastating running back for Tuskegee. Like the sport as a whole, HBCU football was dominated by high-powered coaches, Hall of Famers like Jake Gaither at Florida A&M, and Eddie Robinson at Grambling, the first college coach to win 400 games.
In order for us to have success, you got to put strength on strength and let weakness go to hell. Now, this is what you're going to have to do.
And they were able to draw on an immense pool of talented players.
Let's get out! Let's get out!
When you're talking about historical black college, they never got the due that they so rightly deserve. You can't tell me the players that we had to come out of the historical black schools was not better or as good as the guys back in those days who was thought of as Heisman Trophy candidates.
By the 1960s, it was impossible to ignore how good HBCU football had become. In 1963, the Kansas City Chiefs took Grambling's Buck Buchanan with the first pick in the draft. And over the next 15 years, more than 500 HBCU players were drafted, including some of the best players in pro football history.
Alabama, all the schools in the Southeastern Conference who were saying that, blacks weren't good enough to play, which is why Grambling was loaded, why Texas Southern was loaded, why Prairie View was loaded, why Tennessee State was loaded.
The first time that ball is snapped, you got to knock hell out of him and let him know one thing. That, boy, you going to be in trouble this evening. And the type of ball player you are, you should try to take his head off his shoulders.
This was an era when Grambling was producing more players in the pros than Notre Dame. This was a golden era for black college football.
In 1968, HBCU football felt poised to cross over into mainstream prominence, and Grambling and Morgan State ventured up north for the first time to play a game in the country's biggest market and most famous stadium.
I was one of 3 freshmen who made the Morgan State football team. And this was like a huge deal. To go to Yankee Stadium, my first college football game, we went through Harlem, it was just a whole thing. And you gotta remember 1968, Dr. King got assassinated. There were like riots everywhere. This was a time, everything, whether it was a football game, everything was about race. And it flowed into everything you did. So we all knew that there was more at stake. And I remember we went out there for pregame warm-ups. And it was like, people just coming in, it was just milling in. Big Yankee Stadium's kind of empty. And so we said, oh man, okay, well, what's this about? But it was still just a big deal just to be there. Then we went back inside, to put our stuff on and all that. And then it was time to go out. And I remember going out, and all of a sudden, the place, there were 63,000 people there, and it was unbelievable. There was like the Grambling band, the Morgan band, and when we came out, the place went nuts. And none of us had ever seen these many people before. And this are all black folks in the stands. It was remarkable. It was the most emotional moment I've been a part of because people knew that this was a big deal, not only for us, but for black college football. It all merged. This was a black power, black pride, black consciousness. And the fact that we filled it up, we sold it out. And we put on this great show.
But just as HBCU football was finally getting its moment in the sun, the foundations of its success were about to be eroded by desegregation.
When we talk about this celebration of the Morgan Family game and how great it was because all this talent was on display. Well, that was great, but it also became a problem, and that became, the beginning of the end of this sort of black dominance.
Tell the back where he's going, Jim. Let's go. All right, let's go. All right, come on, hurry.
And all these great players we kind of had to ourselves, and all of a sudden, you began to be recruiting against institutions that you really couldn't really recruit against, all these big white institutions.
Outside for Nathan. He scores.
By the end of the 1970s, the starters on Bear Bryant's formerly all-white Alabama team were 40% black, and he'd won 3 more national championships.
By 1979, the handwriting was on the wall. It was over.
The more the previously all-white schools integrated, the less the top black players across the country were drawn to HBCUs. The era of great HBCU football was done. Since the decline of HBCUs, college football has come to be dominated by formerly all-white schools of the South. 12 of the last 13 national champions are from the South. And the irony is, it's all been accomplished with players they resisted allowing in for so long.
It's going to be black labor, white wealth. We're going to take your best, your most valuable people, and put them into our institutions to make us stronger, and at the same time, make yours crumble. And that became the model of integration.
All we're asking you to give it what you got and try to do what we know how to do. Now let's get after it.